Hey, APUSH gang. I am coming to you from my house. I didn't think I'd be doing this again. Gosh, when we finished virtual learning at the end of last school year, I didn't think I'd be making more videos at home, but here I am. So glad I learned how to do it. I've got my puppy in my lap. I tried recording a video a few minutes ago, and my two dogs were on my bed and they started fighting and growling and barking or playing actually. So I had to stop the video and start over again. So I'm holding one of them. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to put her or him on the ground here in just a second. But Romeo, you want to say hi to everybody? Hey, hello. Hello. He's an alpha dog who is absolutely awful. We love him, but he is not a good dog. He is he's just awful. So anyway, he's going to stay up here with me for a while. In the background, you'll notice I have brought one of my favorite people along with me. This is John Adams in the background, and John, this is a painting that Chapman did for me, I guess when he was a senior. He knows that I am sort of obsessed with John Adams, and I also have, over here, I don't know if you guys can see it, I ran into Heather in the hall today, and she asked me if she needed to bring these home. It is the Green Reader as well as the other book, which I'm forgetting the title, The Light and the Glory. And she asked me if you guys were going to need these, and told her to go ahead and pick them up and bring them home because there's a chance that I won't do it this week, but I might pick something for next week. So stay tuned. I also have this to show you. This is called The Jefferson Lies. It's written by David Barton, and it is the book that I got the article from about the Jefferson Bible that you guys just read. And it is an absolutely fantastic book, and it dispels a lot of the myths and things I've heard about Jefferson over my lifetime, over my own education. And if anybody wants to borrow it or you want to put it on a Christmas list, it is a fantastic read. Thomas Jefferson was a conflicted fellow, and we've talked about this before, and I wish that we could have had the Harkness discussion in class together, but he was clearly a guy that struggled with his own greatness and smartness in the Enlightenment period, and also struggled with just the conflicts of his life related to slavery and his desire for all people to be free, yet at the same time having to be able to make money to support his habit of purchasing things and buying things. So he just was a conflicted fella, and he also lost his wife. I think she was in her 30s, and his daughter wrote that he would have taken his own life if he had not had children to care for. So he suffered a lot of sorrow, a lot of despair, and kind of drowned his sorrows in spending money and living a wealthy land gentry's life. He also traveled abroad quite a bit. He was a very unsettled person. And so I think that we see from his willingness to contribute money to have Bibles printed for the Native American tribes, and his desire that they become Christians, his own thirst and hunger for knowledge and reading the scriptures. He definitely was constantly seeking. I think that early in his life, he had a more stable faith. I think as he got older, through his middle years, he did kind of a Solomon, meaning he found himself to be more important than God. I think that's the impression that I get. And then as he got older, I think he came back around to his faith. So he was kind of all over the place, but God still used him in an incredible way. And the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, when we finally landed on them, were applied to all Americans, black, white, Hispanic, female, male, and they are true. We all are born with the right to life and the right to freely choose what we want to believe and what we don't want to believe. And the government has no say-so in that. So he penned the right words. It just took us a while to get there. I'm going to attempt to put my dog down, but if I have to pick him up again, then I will. So go on down. I don't know if you can see my other puppy. I'll swing around there. Riley is... Hi, Riley. Say hi. Riley is a 50-pound Beagle Lab mix, we think, and she's the sweet one of the bunch. But anyway, all right. Uh-oh, she's coming down here and messing with the other dog. Okay, I'm gonna pick you up again. Okay, anyway, so if you have not already done the writing prompt and opened up the Google Doc and done the writing prompt, you need to stop and hit pause on this video and jump in and do that. I have it scheduled so that it will open up at about 9:30, and then it will be due by 9:45, so 15 minutes. I don't have the ability to make it close off to you once you've opened it up, but if you submit it, if you write it and submit it after 9:45, it will tell me that it was late. So I want you to make every attempt to complete it within the time frame that I have assigned it to. This helps me across the board with all of my classes in preventing cheating. Not that I'm not worried about you guys, but I think it's a good habit. We need to stay on schedule and stay on track. In spite of the fact that you guys are in quarantine, we still need to try to maintain some sort of semblance of order. And I think this is a good way to do it. So if you have some extra crazy circumstance that you need to alter sometimes, you just need to let me know that. Also, if you're sick, if you like COVID or whatever, I don't know that any of you have that, but whatever the case may be, if you're struggling with strep throat or you've got a migraine or whatever, just email me or send me a message on the Google Classroom and let me know, and I'll be happy to extend you some grace in regarding the time frame. But other than that, let's try to stick to the time frame that I've got set out here. So, all right, so with that said, we're going to jump into Chapter 7 and talk about the first few pages of Chapter 7. This is a really interesting segue into the next phase of American life. When the American Revolution ended, as you know, the Articles of Confederation the document, was the first written constitution for the United States. However, it was very ineffective. It didn't perform well. In a desire to create a centralized government that wasn't too powerful, the Articles of Confederation gave way too much power to the state governments and virtually none to the federal government. The only part of the federal government that existed was a single house or a unicameral legislature, and each state had one vote, and they didn't have a whole lot of power. So, and I understand that they had just the American states had just thrown off the British monarch and their ties to the British Empire, and each of the states sort of saw themselves as their own little country, but they wanted to stay together as far as commerce and economic interest. They would be more successful as a group, as all 13, than they would be individually, and so they desired to kind of maintain that. So it was a rough start. Lots of problems arose from that, and Shays' Rebellion being the one that the book gives them the example of, and we'll talk about some other things as well. But at the end of the day, they decided they needed to reverse course because of the failings of the Articles of Confederation. So it only lasted, I think, technically from 1781 to 1788, something like that. So it got us through the American Revolution and set things up in such a way that a new constitution was needed to continue this experiment called the United States of America. Okay, jump into my PowerPoint. So hopefully you've opened up your PowerPoint. I included that in the Google Classroom, and that's generally what I'll do. There'll be a video lecture along with some instructions, and there will also generally be a daily assignment log in which you will open it up and mark off or say yes or no, and let me know what you have completed, and it will ask you specifically. So if you would answer that honestly, I appreciate that. I am going to, I think what I'll do is I'll read all of your answers to the writing prompts on my next video for class on Friday, and hear what your conclusions were, and if you didn't do one of the questions, then I will answer them. So if I'm going to go ahead and land on the PowerPoint that says the Articles of Confederation and Powers of the Confederation Congress. And the way that I describe this to the other class, the idea of confederation, Um, a confederation, at least in regards to this, the Confederation of 13 States was a little bit like the Avengers. So in the Avenger movies, you know how the Avengers were created to tackle problems within the United States, international problems, and they were supposed to be peacekeepers and they were supposed to work together. But in the movie The Avengers, they start to kind of peel away and serve their own interests. Like Iron Man decides to kind of do his thing. Captain America, who's kind of the one true blue pure blood, is always going to do what's right no matter what. People have conflicting ideas about how the best way to move forward with this team. And eventually the Avengers break up. they literally break up and they all go their own way and they all do their own thing and they become ineffective as a unit, as a group. They start out strong, lots of great ideas, but in the end, because they each have their own things that they are hoping to accomplish from this relationship, it kind of falls apart. And so that's sort of how the Articles of Confederation happened. The 13 states came together during the American Revolution. They formed this confederation. They created this constitution, and the national government was tasked with carrying out the war, paying soldiers, creating or signing treaties, those sorts of things. But that was about all they could do. And so when the war finally faded and things got back to normal, or at least people tried to get back to normal life, in the dust of the American Revolution and the dust of this Constitution that was fairly ineffective, the weaknesses of this Constitution became very evident. And so I'm just going to go through the slides here. These are in purple, or it's kind of a blue color. It lists the things that the Articles of Confederation were tasked with doing. The Articles of Confederation gave the federal government or the national government these responsibilities. They could declare war, they could make peace, they signed treaties with foreign countries, with the Indians. They could borrow money from foreign governments, which the Congress did a lot of during the war. They established a postal service, and it's kind of funny because we don't think of that as being a very important thing. That was a serious part of the federal government's responsibilities in the early days. Having a system by which official communications were transferred, personal communications were carried about, and so that remains today an important part of the federal government. My brother-in-law is actually a federal agent who works for the Postal Service. He investigates crimes that are perpetrated through the post office. It could be identification or personal identity theft. It can be threatening letters that are sent to the president. During the election, he and his federal agents literally stayed and observed at the I don't know what they call it, the center at the big postal areas where incoming mail comes, and they were there to make sure that when ballots came in, voter ballots not registration, but actual ballots, that they were processed correctly. So that was a big part of the federal government's responsibility, and it continues to be. They also dealt with things related to Native American tribes. What they didn't have and what they couldn't do. This was the nail in the coffin, so to speak. There was no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation. There was no single leader over the country. There was no president, there was no king, there was no governor that governed head over all 13 states. There was only a Congress. There was also no national judiciary, meaning there was no federal or national judicial system. All legal matters had to go through the state courts, which probably would have been fine, except that what happens when there's disputes between states or between people from different places, became extremely tricky, so complicated that people didn't know what to do. And so it was a single branch federal government made up of a legislative branch, and there was no executive branch and there was no national judiciary. So there was no enforcement mechanism. There was no president that would enforce federal laws. There was no judiciary that would try federal cases. Let's see here, moving on to the next one. The book mentions this pretty significantly. This is my book right here. What I've been doing since last year is I tear out each chapter and I staple it together and I carry it around like this because it's so much easier because that book is so heavy. So I'm going to open up my page. Okay. Probably the best thing that the Articles of Confederation managed to accomplish were the land ordinances of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So, and we are still seeing the effects of that to this day. So the sticking point in getting the Articles of Confederation even ratified to begin with, to make it the law of the land, was that the current 13 states had all of these Western land grabs that had been written into their original promissory, I think that's the word, notes on their charters and whatnot, and constitutions. And so they were guaranteed or promised land west all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So I actually have a picture of one of those lands here. If you want to go down to skip a slide, and you'll see a map there, and it shows you all the different land that Massachusetts had claimed and Connecticut had claimed, and it just goes due west. Of course, at the time, they really didn't have a great idea of how far away the Pacific Ocean was when these states, originally colonies, were established. And so these states were just going to grab everything moving west. It's kind of funny. And so the Confederation Congress had to convince these 13 states to give up their land holdings and to essentially deed them over to this new federal government, to this Confederation Congress, and allow them to control the establishment, the selling, the deeds, titles to land, some sort of format, some sort of way I'll use the word civilize these Western territories. They had seen enough of the problems that had come to be as a result of people moving into Western lands without working through the British government. And so they knew that they'd run into troubles with the Indians. You'd have people claim lands that they had no right to, and then you'd have to uproot them, and the people would get angry. And so figuring out how to manage these Western lands that the United States had garnered in the Treaty of Paris at the end of the American Revolution became critical. And so after much fighting back and forth, all of the 13 states agreed to essentially give their land that they were promised to this new federal government, the Confederation Congress, and allow them to come up with a plan for then distributing it and carving out new states out of this land. Let me go to my next slide here. Go up a slide. I don't know why that slide is there, so I'm just going to read through this and jump back into that. Problems with the Confederation Congress. No, there was problems with the Union of the Confederation of States. There was no national unity. States were behaving as independent countries, looking out for their own good. Political power was distributed equally, even though some states had a small population, large states had a large population. Everybody had only one vote. It was very, very difficult to make any changes to the Articles of Confederation. If it was going to be amended, it required a unanimous vote of all 13 states to make any significant laws. It required 9 of 13 instead of a simple majority. So these are just innate problems within the Confederation Congress, Articles of Confederation. There were lots of money issues, problems after the American Revolution. The government owed a lot of money to foreign countries that they couldn't pay. Congress was unable to collect taxes. I mean, they could say, okay, every state give us, I'm going to try to move him. There we go. Okay, lay back down. Congress could try to collect taxes, but all right, let's watch it down here. No fighting, okay? Congress could try to collect taxes, but at the end of the day, They couldn't force the states to give them any money. What ended up happening is from time to time, when the states had a boom, they would just essentially collect money and send it to the federal government. So that's kind of how it works. So they had no way to collect taxes. Across the country, a huge problem. There was a huge debt problem. There was a currency problem. The federal government had written all these promissory notes during the American Revolution to soldiers and officers, of which they couldn't repay. And so you had farmers going back to their properties, their plantations, their small farms, big farms. They hadn't cycled their crops for a few years. They had purchased equipment prior to the American Revolution to work their farms that they couldn't pay. They couldn't pay the notes on their land. And so financial strain became seriously significant during this time frame as well. Another big problem during the Articles of Confederation amongst the Confederation states was that there was no single means or single code, I'll use the word code, that governed between the states, economic, commerce, traffic, selling across state lines. I use the example of George Washington lives in Virginia, or lived in Mount Vernon is in Virginia. And so George Washington might have a barge full of Mount Vernon pumpkins that he wants to sell over to his neighbors in Maryland across the Potomac River. But he has no way, well, he can sell them to them, but when he goes over to Maryland, they're governed by different tariffs. They have their own tariffs. They have their own duties, their own taxes, their own currency in some cases, sometimes paper money. And so the transactions were hindered. Profit was hindered because of all of this confusion between the various states. And so exasperated, people would just sell within their own area, their own territory, and it hindered economic growth. And so you just have a whole host of economic problems that need to be dealt with. And Americans do what Americans do when they get frustrated economically and otherwise, is that they riot, they protest, they scream at the government, they go to courthouses and they scream and yell, "You can't do this to us. This isn't fair. This isn't freedom." And so those sorts of protests and riots began to spring up across the country. Let's see here. Another thing that it mentions is that because Spain still controlled the rights to the Mississippi River, and so much commerce was conducted up and down the Mississippi River, that was kind of hanging over their head as well. And so going back to the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. These two laws are quoted by historians as being the most important thing that the Confederation Congress accomplished, because in the midst of all of this crazy going on and all this turmoil, this Congress figured out a way to make money. And so the way that they made money was they were going to sell off this massive amount of land that they have just acquired in a very strategic way in 640 acre plots, which is a square mile. They were going to sell it off in 640 acres or 1 square mile plots for $1 per acre, which ended up being, for every square mile that they sold, it was $640 that would go into the federal bank, into the bank for Congress to use. Now, obviously, there were very few people in the country at the time that could afford $640. And so what ended up happening is land speculators or individuals would pool their money together and form these companies like the Ohio Land Company and that sort of thing. They would purchase it from the government and then they would sell it off. So what ended up happening is, as land was being purchased and developed and surveyed, it created this patchwork, almost like literally like a quilt across the country, as boundaries of property and people's lots were squared off. And so when you go up, I think I actually have a picture here. Yeah, when you go up into an airplane and you look down over farmland, it's just a patchwork quilt. As far as the eye can see, and it still is that way today. And so those two ordinances were huge in the development and the success of at least accumulating some money for the Confederation Congress. There are some charts there that show you how they did this and how they had the 640-acre plot and how they eventually, trying to think how this worked. Yeah, that's right. Further down the road in history, the Homestead Act of, I think it's 1862, is going to give away 160-acre plots, which is a quarter of that square mile, to individuals for free in an attempt to settle the West. That's what was left of the West. And there was a lot of land west. It was important to the government to settle that. So you'll see some information there related to that. And there's also some stuff in the book about it. Let me see here. Oh, I see what I did. I duplicated that slide twice, so I will take that out. I hope it doesn't confuse you when you're listening to the video. So I had accidentally put the slide Serious Problems with the New Confederation. I put that in between the Articles of Confederation, the land ordinances, and then pictures of the land ordinance. So I'm going to take that slide out, and it will be after the patchwork quilt. So I hope that doesn't confuse you too much. Then there's a slide that shows you a timetable of events. So let's look at that really quick. Of course, the Declaration of Independence, 1776. The American Revolution lasted from 1775 to 1783. And then the book talks about the Annapolis Convention, but prior to the Annapolis Convention, in 1785, George Washington is an example of one of those men who was a wealthy, well, I mean, at least land wealthy gentry in Virginia, and he was concerned about some of the things he was hearing about the turmoil and things that were happening across the country. Henry Knox, his friend from the American Revolution, big old Henry Knox, who is going to serve as his Secretary of War when he becomes president, is writing him letters, super concerned about the situation up in Massachusetts. He's hearing about Shays' Rebellion, and Shays' Rebellion is sparking fires all across farmland in almost all of the states, and people are hearing about it. And so George Washington invites some representatives, for lack of a better word, from some of his neighboring states to discuss some of the economic challenges of interstate commerce between states. And they came up with some good ideas to work amongst the 3 or 4 states right in that region. And so another invitation was extended. Alexander Hamilton gets involved. They're still very close, he and Washington. They call for a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, where further discussions are done amongst some of the state leadership about ways that they can try to fix the problems with interstate commerce, international commerce, tariffs, and that sort of thing. And then word spreads all over the country about the growing problem of Shays' Rebellion. Just as a refresher, Daniel Shay was a disgruntled farmer from western Massachusetts. He had served in the American Revolution. He had actually even received some sort of prize sword or something from Marquis de Lafayette for his combat and his good job as a soldier in George Washington's army. So he had actually served in Washington's unit. But he came home. He had not been paid for probably a year. His farm was in dangerous risk of being recalled or dispossessed by the repossessed by the federal by the debtor courts. At the time in our country, there were these things called the debtor courts, and basically if somebody couldn't pay their bills, this particular court would issue selling off the land to pay the debts, and sometimes they would actually throw people in prison, in debtor's prison, because they couldn't pay their debt, which that doesn't help them pay their debt, but that's what they did. That was a practice in Europe as well. And so Daniel Shay and about 1,000 men followed him, very frustrated by the fact that The courts in Massachusetts, the government was not listening to their cries for help. That part of the economic problem was directly related to the way Massachusetts government was handling the problem and the financial crisis. The merchants and the debtors, they wanted their money, and they didn't want notes of promise from these farmers. They wanted silver and gold. There was a shortage of silver and gold. And the Massachusetts Assembly was doing nothing to assist the farmers. And so people got really, really angry. And my dog is snoozing over there. There we go. So anyway, this happened over the course of a year between 1786 and 1787. And ultimately, Daniel Shay's men armed themselves. They marched to courts across the countryside. The courts were closed. They prevented people from being incarcerated, which was successful. And then they decided to march on I think it was a state armory, and they were going to confiscate the weapons. And enough was enough, and the governor of Massachusetts managed to raise a militia who met them there, and it was their final straw. And several of them were arrested, several of them were executed. Daniel Shay was eventually captured, and I believe he was pardoned, but I don't remember by who. I don't remember who, if it was the governor of Massachusetts or ultimately when we had a president. I can't remember. So anyway, it was a mess. And so Shay's rebellion was the catalyst, the final straw that sent those men from all 13 states with the exception of Rhode Island to meet in Philadelphia once again at the Philadelphia State Capitol, or the Capitol building, Capitol Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been forged and independence movement had been birthed. And they go back to the same place. They ask George Washington to preside over the proceedings, which he agrees to do, probably a little reluctantly and sad, because he really wasn't interested in jumping back into politics. He had retired from his position as general and was enjoying his time at Mount Vernon. So he goes back to the hot seat. He's simply there as a stabilizing force. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are in France and other places during this time. They were overseas, and so they weren't even involved in the writing of the Constitution, which is irony at its best. But Benjamin Franklin was there. He was an old man at 81. And when they met at, I just looked at my slides again. The next slide after I'm looking at the timeline and so I'm walking through that. So let me move ahead real quick. So I just talked about the Constitutional Convention and meeting there at Philadelphia. There is a picture of Mount Vernon and referencing the Annapolis Convention. So there was the Mount Vernon Conference and the Annapolis Convention. The picture of the dining room right there, that is the dining room in Mount Vernon, and I'm hoping you guys will get to see that in the spring. Much of the furniture in that room was actually repurchased from people that had bought it from the estate when the estate fell into disrepair. I believe that the woman who gave us our tour said that the dining room table and a few other items in that room were actually original to George Washington's time. The paint in the room the room was repainted to match the colors that have been described in some of Washington's memoirs, and of course also you could see the paint. They would just paint over paint over paint over paint, so they were able to match it pretty good. But the Mount Vernon conference predominantly took place in this dining room. They sat around the dining room and they had the conversation. The next picture is a picture of George Washington's backyard. There's a porch there, a very large porch, the length of the back house. You see there with chairs sitting there. And it looks out onto the Potomac River, and beyond the Potomac River, on the other side of that river, is Maryland. And George Washington very much wanted to be able to trade with his neighbors across the river. There's a picture of Shay's Rebellion, and then the Philadelphia State House. And so I'm just going to kind of zip through this without even looking at my slides. So there were a couple things, the orders of business. They decided they would debate as one large committee rather than breaking into several little committees. so that they could have free flow of conversation. James Madison, a little guy from Virginia, a good friend of Thomas Jefferson's, showed up at the plan called the Virginia Plan. He was from Virginia. He had been researching the history of republics and democracies and successful and unsuccessful things that worked and things that didn't work throughout history. Came up with a pretty good plan. I would say pretty much everybody understood there needed to be a stronger central government. How much stronger, time would tell. Certainly the federal government we have today is way beyond what was ever imagined back in 1787. But James Madison's plan called for a bicameral legislature, a two-house legislature, a House of Representatives, and a Senate. Under the Virginia plan, both of those would be based on population, but the small states threw a complete stink and said, well, we will have no influence whatsoever in our government if the strength or the power of our position is based on our population. And so the Great Compromise, sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, which was written by the Representative Roger Sherman from Connecticut, called for the compromise being, well, the House of Representatives will be based on population. They will be directly elected by the people. But the Senate will be a more mature delegation, people, stately men who are selected by their state legislatures to serve the people for a period of 6 years. And every state will get 2 senators. It will be equal representation in the Senate. And so that satisfied the need of the small states to have a say-so. I'm very thankful that they came up with this compromise, because if they had not, states like Arkansas and Oklahoma and smaller states today would really have no say-so in our federal government, because the larger states like Florida and New York and Texas and California would run the show. And so that was very forward thinking. And let's see here. Of course, it also called for a strong executive branch with a president. I think the book said that Hamilton's idea was for the president and the Congress to serve for life, or the Senate to serve for life, and then the House of Representatives to be elected. And nobody went for that. That was too far over the top. Hamilton loved the British model. He was, even though he was American, he had lots of British connections, and so he liked the British model. But that didn't fly. And so ended up, the Virginia plan presented a 3-branch government. The House of Representatives and the Senate were the legislative branch. The executive branch, of course, the president, the enforcing power of the legislative branch, and then also means were made for a federal judiciary that would deal with federal issues, interstate troubles, and issues that affected the whole country. As it turned out, the federal branch of the federal government, the judicial branch, really just kind of copycatted or mirrored what already existed in the state courts: a district court, an appellate court, and a Supreme Court. All the states already had that, and so they duplicated that at a federal level. So we have a federal district courts, federal appellate courts, and a federal Supreme Court that we've heard a lot about lately. Let's see here. There were lots of compromises in this Constitution. In order to get it passed, there had to be compromises. Many of them dealt with slavery. The 3/5 compromise dealt with how to appoint or assign the number of delegates that each state would have based on population. Southern states, as well as northern states that had slavery, wanted to be able to count their slaves as population for the total population. Even though they didn't consider them in some cases people, they still wanted to count them in the total number of people to increase the number of representatives that they had. And so when there didn't seem to be any way around this, the compromise was that slave owners could count their slaves in the total population of their state, but only 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted in the total population. And that's where you come up with the expression 3/5 compromise. The African slave trade was left untouched until 1808, I think it was. The Electoral College is an interesting idea. most democracies don't have an electoral college, but effectively our founding fathers were concerned about the mob rule and, as James Madison would call it, the exercise of liberty by the masses can also be problematic because they're not always informed, educated, etc., and they can make decisions that are binding upon everybody, and they can be bad decisions. And so to avoid the general electorate or voters choosing a poor presidential candidate, they put the hands or the destiny of the future of who was going to become president into the hands of these delegates who would be, or electorates who would be chosen by the state legislatures. Now, as it turns out, most electors vote based upon the will of the people, but they don't have to, and it's state to state's different. But technically the president is not directly elected by the people. They are elected by the electorates who are chosen from each state delegation. So last little bullet point on there says amending the Constitution. So the Articles of Confederation required all 13 states to vote for an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, and that proved to be impossible. And so the Constitution comes up with a little bit easier way to amend itself, which is the brilliance of the U.S. Constitution. It is the longest serving written Constitution in the world. It's duplicated all over the place, and that's because it has the ability to change itself, all right, through the amendment process. So the 6th article of the Constitution spells out how to amend the Constitution. It requires 2/3 of both the House and the Senate to propose an amendment to the Constitution. And if it passes both the House and the Senate by a 2/3 vote, then that amendment goes to the states, where then the states have to vote by 3/4. 3/4 of the states have to approve this proposed amendment. So it's pretty hard to pass an amendment to change the Constitution. The Constitution's only been changed 27 times. The first 10 is the Bill of Rights, and it was a package deal. And then 11 through 27 have been passed out over the course of the 200 plus years of the Constitution. So it's pretty tough to amend the Constitution. And then my last slide on this particular PowerPoint talks about the principles of checks and balances, or separation of powers, and federalism. So the Constitution built within itself gave the 3 branches of government tools in order to impede other branches of government from abuse of power. So for instance, if you've got a crazy Congress that wants to socialize healthcare across the board and take that out of the hands of the people, most presidents would probably veto that. Although if Joe Biden ends up becoming president, he will probably sign it into law. But if a president vetoes something that Congress wants to pass, then Congress can override the veto, but they have to override it by a 2/3 majority, and that's very difficult to do. The judiciary can rule that a law is unconstitutional passed by Congress. The House of Representatives can impeach a president. So in this separation of powers, the Constitution has given each of them the ability to impede the other. And that's all an attempt to diffuse power amongst the 3 branches of government and to avoid the abuse of power, which often comes with governmental power. So, and then federalism in this context is the idea that there are 2 systems of government happening at the same time. The umbrella, the federal government, it has its own realm of responsibilities, protecting the country, military, international trade, treaties, that sort of thing. And then you have the state governments who are operating the school systems and law enforcement and things like that. I'm kind of going blank at this point, but so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But those are 2 principles that are worked into the Constitution. So I've talked way too long. Follow any further instructions. I haven't thought beyond that. I still have to make a video for my other class, so I am running late tonight. So do the writing prompt to watch this video. I may tag you on a couple of additional videos to special or just in addition to reinforce the lesson. I'll try not ever to make a lesson that lasts more than the 90 minutes that we would have in class. So like right now, let's see, I've been blabbing for almost 45 minutes. The writing prompt is 15 minutes. So in effect, we have been visiting for about an hour. So I probably will direct you to a couple of short little video clips to watch related to this lesson, just to reinforce what I've talked about. So your reading assignment for this coming Friday is in RenWeb. I will also probably include it in my instructions. So make sure you keep reading, and then look for another video on Friday. Make sure that you upload or open up the Google Doc and fill everything out and submit it by the end of class today at 11 a.m. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, or you can also make comments on the Google Classroom or the stream where everybody can see it. So whatever you want to do. Anyway, bye.